begin. So welcome everybody. This is Doug McCall from the International School Health Network, and thank you to this somewhat hastily put together session on the UN Transforming Education Summit. As many of you will be also engaged, we're in the process of submitting ideas and participating in the consultations to that summit. And as those of you who have been involved, it's quite a massive undertaking with several tracks of work and lots of different things going on. So I thought we'd just take a chance to update each other in terms of anything that's really, really pertinent to our work in school health and development, and then also to look at a submission that we've been developing, which is basically an updating of the FRESH framework and some advice about how those kinds of frameworks like FRESH and others could be better used in transforming education systems. So that's really the intent of the session. And I'm going to be asking for comments at an possible deadline as well, because we're actually already late in making this submission and we actually don't quite fit into the form that they've provided online for us. But the next meeting, and I've just looked at it just now, is Thursday for the action track number 1, which is inclusive, equitable, safe, and healthy schools. And although I think the submission applies to several tracks of work, as denoted on the screen, I would like to try to have submitted that before that next meeting. It's those discussions are quite broad, and there's many people online. But I hope to be able to have this submission in by Thursday morning. So if you have any chance today or tomorrow to comment, I'd much appreciate it, and I'll try to include them on Wednesday evening before Thursday morning. I know it's impossible, and the staff at UNESCO are working with impossible deadlines too. So it's not their fault. It's just the challenge of doing a summit like this in 3 or 4 months. So just basically commenting a little bit about you can see the description of this session. We're going to look at a draft submission, but I thought we'd just give a chance to look at the many things going on in the TESS, as they've called it, affectionately, I'm sure, Transforming Education Summit, and any insights as to what's happening inside of that huge machine or several machines going on at once we can share at this point. Just go to the next slide, I hope. I think I'm pushing the right button. It's not advancing. Not sure why that's not happening. Oh, there, I see. Okay, I can do it this way. So these are the TESS web pages that you probably already know about, but just in case, the top one is dealing with it's the landing page or the welcome page for the event, and you can see the link there. The good thing to read, if you haven't already done so, is the concept note. Provides an overview of the intent of the whole event, and the third one is a guide to how to get involved, which includes the fourth bullet there, the fourth point. You need to register to join some of the discussions. So we'll post these slides, or you can find it online if you just look for UN Transforming Education Summit, and you'll be able to find the page that says where you can register. And they obviously do have a Twitter account and probably doing other social media as well. Any sort of general comments about engaging in the process? If people stop here, and rather than me doing all the talking, is there any comments or insights that you can offer to each of us in terms of how you've been able to participate in the event, or things that are going on that you think are really pertinent to share for everybody? And this, as you know, the recording will be widely distributed and actually is visited quite often after these webinars. So just stop and talk a little bit about the process of the summit. There is an upcoming pre-summit in Paris on 28 to 30 June. And then, of course, the event itself, the summit itself, is on the 19th of September in New York. We're hoping actually to be engaged in a pre-summit side meeting on the 18th with a group of educators. But just stop and any comments or suggestions that we could share. Just wave your hand if you wanted to. If not, I'll move on to the actual content then.
Jeannie had a question.
Sure. Jeannie?
Yeah, and I was on a call yesterday with the school nutrition community of practice, and Carmen had a chance to give us an update from the school health and nutrition side of kind of some of their goals for the pre-summit. And I was just wondering if this idea you had for updating FRESH to be kind of more inclusive, equitable, safe, etc., is linked to that, or is that separate? And I'm just kind of interested to note, she made a comment that I thought I have felt a little bit through this process with it. Some of the, like Action Track 1 actually has, you know, safe schools folks, education and emergencies folks, like it's a very big group, but it, and gender, and I mean, everyone is in there, but it also seems like that some of these almost subsectors within this bigger umbrella are sort of gunning for like their role in some of the, you know, in transforming the education system. And so then to be having a separate SH10 meeting and all these separate meetings, it's very telling of kind of some of the silos that we work in. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that. And she didn't say, Carmen didn't say whether this on-site meeting had been approved, but I think that at least WFP, UNESCO, and UNICEF are looking to have one. So just your open that up.
Good insight. And that's and I'm involved in that community practice as well. I didn't make the meeting yesterday, and I have actually corresponded with Carmen and commented in one of the meetings about the incredible overlap, but not overlap, the number of groups and organizations and issues and programs that are trying to find their way into schools. And that's one of the challenges I hope the submission will try to address. But it's reflected in the conference or the summit itself, but it's also reflected in the real world that there's so many challenges to including inclusion and equity and health and safety and sustainable education and so on, that it's overwhelming. It's a very crowded landscape, and therefore that's reflected in these discussions. And what I'm suggesting we try to say is that there needs to be a higher power, an overview, really has to be a whole of government perspective, not only in the education system, but at the higher levels in terms of the First Minister's offices or mechanisms that have been established by the government itself. Is that so this kind of process is it's always going to be messy, but a little bit better aligned and a little bit better coordinated, which is one of the points in the brief. And that's really important if schools are not going to continue to be overwhelmed. And we've always promoted our own work, our own issues, our own programs, our own frameworks, which is all well and good. That's what we need to do, but we need to try to take an educator perspective as well. And part of the brief talks about how the scale up and sustainability of the many good frameworks that we're using is just not there. There's very few programs that actually survive in the real world that get beyond recruiting schools. School meals is one good example that has an individual program done well, but broadening it out to other issues around going beyond nutrition or really school meals has been challenging for them. And it's true of all the others. Emily, I see you have your hand up, so maybe jump right in.
Hello, Doug, and hello, everyone. Perhaps there's this question on how to engage. So actually submitting a good practice, as you're suggesting, Doug, is an excellent thing to do. And if around your networks, you want to encourage other countries or partners also to submit good practices, feel free to do so. The conversation will keep going, and so even if the sooner the better, it's always good to have new good practices coming in and to inform the pre-summit, but also the summit coming later. Our sense is that good practices that are grounded in country experience will get more traction. So that's also something to keep in mind, but we can discuss that in the next part of the meeting when we discuss the submission in particular. But that to say here that don't hesitate to share good practices or to invite your government counterparts in country to submit good practices as well, to keep the conversation as open and engaging as possible. Now, you might have seen from the pre-summit website that we finally got the confirmation that there will be, of course, a main agenda that lasts for 3 days now, but there will also be opportunities for 2 types of events. They're calling them, and that's a bit confusing, they're calling them side meetings for meetings that will last between 1 and 2 hours. And these are the broad type of side meetings we are used to in big conferences where there will be translation, opportunity to connect remotely, etc. So indeed, Jean, we are working with UNICEF and with WFP on an initial concept note that will also submit it to the broader interagency group on school health and nutrition, so that really all this partnership comes behind and supporting this side meeting. In addition to that, there's an opportunity to submit proposals for what they call side events, and these are a bit different from what we are used to. These side events are for 20 to 30 people and are meant to last less than an hour. I don't remember exactly, I think it's 40 minutes, to address a specific, to rally a conversation around a specific topic or a specific initiative or a specific country experience. The deadline to submit side meeting and side event proposals is, if I recall well, I've seen Friday and Monday's deadline, so I'm a bit confused, but to be super safe, by the end of the week, and it could be that the deadline has been extended to Monday. So should Fresh or any other organization be willing to submit something, that's the deadlines to submit initial proposals. As you can see, the pre-summit is approaching very, very quickly. And I understand that decisions will be made mid-June to confirm which side meetings and side events have been accepted. The side meeting we are working on, and it's far from being accepted, is just a proposal we are submitting, as I said, with UNICEF, WFP, and the other agencies of the interagency group. Is really what you described, Doug. It's a comprehensive approach to school health and nutrition, highlighting opportunities for more integrated programming and cross-sectoral collaboration, and also highlighting some specific areas of work where it has been successfully integrated into broader approaches. So there will be something around integrating school feeding into broader school health and nutrition. We are planning to have a focus on mental health, for instance, and etc. And we are also hoping that may provide an opportunity to showcase the very initial findings from the global status report on school health and nutrition, which you remember is due for publication in the fall, but we might have an executive brief and some highlights to share in the pre-summit if our side event is accepted and if partners agree to share these initial highlights. That's it on my side for now, and we can discuss the submission after.
Excellent, thank you. That's, as I say, it's overwhelming, the process. I also, maybe to reassure a little bit, the summit is not foreseen to be the end of any discussions. There are, if you read through the materials, plans to follow up in different ways, encouraging the action tracks to continue if they're not already continuing to work together, and there's obviously at the country level, if they've just started their national consultations in terms of transforming their school systems, that's obviously going to continue afterwards. So that it's not just a one-time event. At least I hope it's not a one-time event. It actually is structured in a way that we can continue. And it would be a very confusing number of strands coming out of the summit, but I think it's still a chance to look at it. I did also, maybe it's something that's been hitting at me since I've been trying to catch up, is most of our discussions in Fresh and other groups has been, we're kind of on the outside of the school system, we're trying to persuade the school systems to do something about health and nutrition or whatever our issue of the day is. But I think it's important that the summit look at the core elements of the school system and take it from an education system perspective, outside, inside out rather than outside in. I was pleased in the invitation to the Paris meeting that they talked a little bit about that. And this group of educators that's formed is going to be talking about what are the core elements, what are the guts of a school system, the national curriculum framework, the goals of education, the administrative core, all those core decisions that school systems make. And I see others on the line will know a lot more about that than I do. But what are those core elements of the school system, and how, if and how they get changed, transformed to promote inclusion and equity? What's that look like? And so it's an inside out. And so then all the other actors outside of the school system can start to think about how they fit within an existing reality of schools. And that's, I think, something that I think that perspective needs to be strengthened in the discussions thus far, because it's also been most of us guys trying to get stuff going on in schools. And the other, for the UN summit, I've never been to a UN General Assembly, but it brings in heads of state. And so at that kind of macro level, I mean, it's way above my pay grade ever, but it's going to be a different kind of discussion. There's been a couple of online forums that have had the ambassadors from different countries speaking and stuff, and it's a totally different angle, perspective that is taken. They're not necessarily involved directly in schools. They are heads of state or they're ambassadors to the UN, and so it's a different audience in many ways. And so I think we need to sort of take that into account when we talk about going to influence what's happening in New York. It's going to be a different kind of perspective. Anything else on process, or the process is already underway? Okay, maybe go on to the next slide then. These are the some of the key points in the submission. I just wanted to extract them and take a look at them. It's really pleasing to see that the concept note and the materials from the summit are talking about how education is connected to other sectors. It's not as strong as it should be, but some of the wording does talk about cross-sectorial participation beyond the education sector, and health and social protection, agriculture, labor, environment, public safety, finance. We could add security systems, human rights agencies, the list goes on. And then I've added heads of government. It's there implicitly. So that's in the materials. It's not as strong, I think, in my view anyway, as it needs to be. Because the second point, school systems are not going to be able to be transformed unless there is a lot more, not only coordination with other sectors, but a lot more contributions from other sectors to work with and within school systems. It's not only up to school systems to be able to address all of the challenges to inclusion and equity that exist in societies. And so there has to be a mechanism to engage those other sectors and get commitments out of those other sectors, not just by projects and technical advice, but actually commitments to staffing and policy and programming. The good news out of that second point is that there are several ways that have been developed to do that, several frameworks. These frameworks are well understood. Child-friendly schools, education in emergencies, they have their standards, health promoting schools, safe schools, and many, many others. There are actually, the FRESH framework had identified one core set of indicators and 13 themes. We've now been working with a list of 20 sectorial partnerships that are broad, and then about another 20 different specific programs on bullying or peace education or extreme violent extremism, or you can name the list, just goes on and on. And so this brief tries to focus on the experience or the necessity to use a proper framework that engages both the education sector, but also the other sectors that are dealing with those issues. And if it's not done properly and effectively, as we experience in the real world, then school systems will not be able to be transformed, in my view. The third point, it goes back into the history of FRESH and some of those applications. We've in FRESH have broadened our experience to really start with the notion of the whole child, which is the whole child who is fed, safe, protected, emotionally secure, challenged, able to learn, and so on. That whole child movement is strong in education and needs to be adopted in maybe with different words in other sectors. For example, in the health sector, I can hardly say this word, but it's salutagenes. It means like a whole holistic perspective of health. And there are other sectors that have those similar kind of languages to the whole child. And that needs to be the guiding principle at the macro level, at the whole of government level. As I said, the last point there are over 20 different, what we called multi-component approaches, safe schools, healthy schools, community schools, et cetera, and many more specific programs. And we are struggling to get the survey and policy analysis, policy curriculum analysis done. It's turned out to be a life's work, but we are able to draw out of the findings thus far, and it's been primarily in the list of documents and profiles that we're creating that we're able to populate some of the points we made in the brief by finding that countries are actually doing things related to the brief. For example, it looks like most countries are actually implementing about between 5 and 15 such frameworks, which means they definitely need to be aligned and coordinated and not be competing and operating alone within a country. Maybe stop and ask for comments and discussion of that. I'm having trouble keeping up with the chat, so if you just want to, okay, I'll come back to it, but please keep an eye on the chat for me so that I can, if you wanted to bring an item out of the chat, please do so. But I'll stop here and sorry, just get the right page I was on there. Any comments about that sort of the key background to the submission? Any thoughts about that? I think that kind of recalls our previous conversation about the coming out of the school nutrition community practice. All right, I'll go to the next point. Again, it's sort of some more detail. The frameworks, there's lots of good research evidence. I hope that list that we've been building is useful to you. The evidence shows that if interventions at a school level are coordinated within a broad perspective, within a holistic approach, that the controlled trials show that changes can be made in knowledge, attitudes, and some intentions to behave in a different way. It's hard to follow up in. Most studies don't get beyond 2 or 3 years of follow-up, but at least intentions, age-appropriate intentions for behavioral change seem to come out of the studies as well. And the background in some of the frameworks, health promoting schools is probably the most studied, but community schools, social emotional learning has a good knowledge base to it, school food and nutrition, education in emergencies and so on. There's a lot of good documentation, not only in research, but also in reports reflecting practice and in terms of more the database studies that do correlations as well. So the evidence is clear. The problem, though, is that most programs don't get scaled up to the national level. They're not scaled up to the ministry level in terms of sustained support. And often they fade after the initial project or project funding or research funding runs out. There's lots of guidance documents with really good checklists and lots of lofty aspirations and so on. But to translate those big frameworks into policies that actually require coordinated interventions and actually require allocate resources in terms of staffing and funding on a sufficient scale, it's very rare. The money is often, the resources, the staffing is often dispersed based by the latest problems of the day, and not by sort of a long-term plan that should be guided by a framework. And so that's, and that the evidence is clear. There's in fact one study which followed up on the school level studies and found that none of the studies that they identified were able to continue the work after the external support was withdrawn. In my view, in my experience, there's only one program, and it makes the same point, in Taiwan, where there's been a lot of external support for health promoting schools out of the Ministry of Health in Taiwan, and they use a school accreditation model. And to my knowledge, that's the one example of a sustained national program in using a framework. Most are reliant on local initiatives and local school volunteers to follow through. The last point, the competition among the frameworks is pretty fierce, and many models or frameworks are actually more of a wish list than a practice or a policy or plan. So again, I'll stop and see if that's sparked any conversation.
Yeah, I do have a question. Did you find when you were talking about Taiwan, and is that kind of like the only positive deviant country that you found in this review, where you know, instead of competing different frameworks and you know, they sort of really implemented a national policy with one framework that would sort of intersectorially be accepted and implemented by different ministries in schools? Is that like, is Taiwan kind of like the only country that you found that did that?
No, and actually the Taiwan example is really on health promoting schools. So it's just the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Education. And I'd actually argue against trying to take all of these frameworks and merge them into one, or to find one that fits all, because once you lose the specific focus of health or safety or human rights or peace education or global citizenship, the other ministries lose interest. And so it's better, I think, to have a number of frameworks in operation, as countries have chosen, and therefore engage the other ministries in working with the education ministry, rather than find a super duper model covering everything. And that's, there's evidence to show that if you go too broad a scope, it's actually in one of the better practices. If you try to go too broad a scope in what you're trying to do, it's not practical in the real world to be able to do that. So you need to have several frameworks operating which engage several sectors in addressing several challenges, rather than trying to, starting from the point of the whole child, starting with that overview. And that means the decision to go that route has to be done at the above the Ministry of Education and above all the other ministries, has to be done at the head of government level, in my view. And there were one or two examples where that seems to be happening. But in Taiwan, they have a really good program. They have this, they have an accreditation program with the schools accept accreditation as a standard. and the culture and the discipline and the governance structure in Taiwan permits that. Most other countries would not have that cultural discipline and governance structure and traditions. There were some similar examples in Wales and England. Wales, I'm not sure of the status. There was another example in Singapore and another example in England where actually that accreditation strategy eventually was dropped. So it's kind of a depressing, sobering is a better word, sobering reality, I think. But I think bluntly, we need to recognize and not pretend that we'll just keep hoping and dreaming that something will change without trying to identify some things that need to be changed. Other comments? No, sorry, okay, I've got hands up, so I'll just, Jeannie and Emily again.
Doug, I was wondering, my team was looking at the health promoting schools framework, just kind of as we're talking about updating FRESH and all the different frameworks that exist. And I noticed that health promoting schools took like components of FRESH, it took components of, I don't know what the acronym stands for, the G-SHIP surveys. And it seemed to also incorporate some other thematic areas that maybe FRESH didn't when it was originally created. And I was just wondering, when you're thinking about updating FRESH, you know, how does that feed into some of like these newer initiatives like health promoting schools? Would it complement? Would it be even more comprehensive, or what are your thoughts?
Well, actually, we're not trying to update FRESH because the value of FRESH, the core indicators, I think, is that those core indicators can be applied in other frameworks. You know, having a macro policy, having a really good health and life skills education program, having a collection of student services, engaging parents, and so on. Those are all core elements of almost any framework that's being used. And the FRESH, when it was formed, identified 13 themes, which are really 13 other frameworks dealing with a variety of topics, from malaria through to safety and so on. There's, you know, disaster risk reduction. There are actually several of the themes in FRESH have been taken up, and there's many more. So I think what this conversation, I hope, introduces is that the health promoting schools is really obviously a partnership with the health sector, and it goes beyond the health sector to other sectors. But if you're going to be addressing an issue like child abuse or conflict, there are other frameworks that are better. You know, in conflict affected countries, in my view, the best framework to use is education in emergencies. It's got a really good set of standards, and why invent another wheel or try to adapt the health promoting schools model to do what education in emergencies is already doing? Why don't we just use that as the framework for cooperating with that sector, the relief aid sector? Or if you look at the Ending Violence Coalition has a really good framework, and they've really got, you know, a really good getting into capacity issues and so on. We don't have to try to morph the health promoting schools model to deal with ending violence. There's a really good set of partners and ideas and framework that we can use there. Social emotional learning is a relatively undeveloped area for us in health, but it's got a huge following around from the education sector. So why don't we use that as a momentum building rather than, so to be clear, the FRESH framework is the value add for FRESH, I think, is that it identifies those core components, which are going to be common to all. But it's not a super duper model. It's not something that needs, and in fact, some people, I remember being in one country where FRESH was seen as a competitor to health promoting schools, which is not the point of that framework. It's attention, the competition for attention, which is kind of sobering. Emily? Sorry, Emily, you had your hand up, or is that from the previous?
Yeah, no, it's a new hand, and thank you for that. I think we here all agree. Looking at perhaps how things are framed, also, it's as you were saying, Doug, I think it's important to in a way be sovereign and recognize that complex frameworks might not work everywhere, and recognize perhaps have a more positive perspective, because what we found in the global status on school health and nutrition, and what partners have been also pushing us to highlight in a way, is that many countries are already implementing integrated programs at scale with wide reach, with own fundings. And it might not be ideal, it might not be what the ideal framework would push for, it might not include all the sectors we would like to see, and actually intersectoral collaboration and coordination is one of the key challenges I identified across the board. But what we do see is that countries and education sectors are increasingly prioritizing in their strategies and in the allocation of funding as well, to a great extent, the health and well-being of students, and defining some form of integrated programs to address that. So perhaps in the submission is also important to highlight that while much more needs to be done, and we have many recommendations we could bring to the table, we can build on amazing efforts and investments that are already being done, and they are done because there is evidence that they work, because countries are prioritizing it. And I think it's important to have that perspective, so that we don't come with an overwhelming agenda coming from a theoretical perspective, but really building on what we see on the ground, that what countries are already prioritizing. For this type of summits is really, I think, important to come with something that that is transformative and brings a vision, but also showing that it's feasible, that it has been done, that we have lots to build from, and that it's not partners coming with an agenda and trying to prioritize things that are not being prioritized already.
Yeah, good point. And actually, maybe it's because I'm old and tired, but having being optimistic about what is being done, and identifying the progress that's being made. If you read through some of the models, the ending violence model and the work they're doing is, they've got 30 countries. They've got a country, it's like a mini UN summit all around ending violence, and they've got really good criteria, and they've got a really good framework, and the countries are implementing it, and so on. Or if you look at how the education and emergency framework has evolved, it's really been well adopted globally, as well as within countries that are dealing with conflicts. And so I shouldn't reflect. We shouldn't say that. We need to be positive in the brief, and there will, of course, in the UN summit, I'm sure we'll be talking about a lot of success stories, because that's how countries get motivated. Politicians like to have a success they can talk about, and that's really good too. But we need to be both sober and positive, I guess, is the takeaway there, and we need to provide specific tools for countries to use to be able to make those intersectoral connections stronger, because that's, in my view, that's the challenge. It's not just around an issue or a program, it's actually around the mechanisms of government, which need to be thought through better. Further comments and questions before we, okay, I'll go to the next. And these are the better practices in what the brief calls selecting, scaling up, sustaining, and coordinating the frameworks. And the goal of it in this case is to enable and support school system transformation. In my view, without the better frameworks, better coordination, we cannot expect school systems to do all of this by themselves. And a lot of us, for many years, and I'm one of them, has been really trying to persuade educators to do more and do it better. And here's the checklist and all that. And it's just not going to be possible unless all the other sectors make equal commitments of staffing and funding and political attention to that. Schools are just not going to be the empty vessel that we have always treated them as. They've got lots of other stuff they need to deal with. So that's kind of the measure. And so here are the the items that are in the brief. Maybe I'll just take each one and sort of talk about it. You've got the brief. I hope you've had a chance to scan it at least. And one of the things that we need to do better at is to measure and monitor the capacities of the frameworks to go to that, to really look how many countries do have an inter-ministry agreement on their framework or frameworks. How many ministries have coordinators assigned at the ministry level full time? How many of those coordinators do have a full-time staff to work with and a line budget? How many have a number of those kinds of capacity? We don't need to go into, but we need to pay attention to the system capacities, not just at the school level, but at the system level. And that's kind of the shift that the fact-finding survey and document analysis is trying to make, is to identify those mechanisms that measure and monitor the capacities of the frameworks to get there, to be sustained. And there's a really good example, the ending violence one I've used, but I'm sure there are other examples that we can point to. And school meals is one where with that program, school meals has been successful in almost every country in being implemented. And it is possible to extend beyond school meals to the school nutrition approach. And then it is possible to go to other physical health problems, primarily where it really works best in low resource countries, because that's what they're struggling with. That's where the priorities are. So there are success stories of countries that have been able to do that. But if you ask if they're going on to other challenges and look for the coordination mechanisms, I don't think we'll find them. So any comments on that, building up and monitoring the capacity of frameworks? Is there any disagreement with that? Any clarification of that needs to be done from the text of the submission? If not, I'm going to go to the second one. Sorry, go ahead.
No, perhaps because I won't have time to review if you're planning to submit back tomorrow, just to say that I find all these very, very good. One suggestion perhaps I might have is to keep it as simple as you can, because the Secretariat and the team looking at the submissions are receiving many, many submissions. And so the shorter and the simpler, the better, I would say. And here I feel there are some things that perhaps you could merge to keep the list shorter. So for instance, comprehensive agreements and formal mechanisms to coordinate might come together. Joint sector reviews and measuring and monitoring, perhaps you can consider clustering. Yeah, those are the tools that I see, but there might be opportunities to further simplify, to have a shorter submission.
Yeah, good suggestion. Although I struggle because the actual form to fill in is anticipating very small specific practices, program type practices. Where each of these 8 items is really a systems change strategy rather than a practice that's gone on in a certain country in a certain context and has been demonstrated to be successful. So I was kind of working outside that mold in drafting this. There's actually, although I understand the challenge you're trying to address with that suggestion, because of the capacity to absorb it at one end, particularly in these timelines. In fact, there are other more specific, there are other kinds of system change strategies that could be added to this list rather than shortening the list. I know that when it goes to the UN Summit, none of the senior people there will have time to read more than a page or two, but it's important that we start with some specific practices that on systems change that can actually be identified, and that we've uncovered countries using them. And that was the example. I'm going to go to that number 5. There's a couple of countries that in that example, but coming from Canada, I was always very interested in and impressed by the work that's done by Healthy Child Manitoba. It's an interagency mechanism established by the government of Manitoba to coordinate ministries, across ministries on children and youth. and they have research, they have a law behind them, they have a cabinet committee meeting, cabinet authority, and they've been able to pull together early childhood, school age. It really is a mechanism that every country should consider. Can do it differently in different ways, but that mechanism of an independent or coordinating mechanism is an idea that I think really needs to be replicated around the world. There are some examples, not only in Manitoba, I'm sure, but that's the strategy, and it's quite specific. You need a law behind it, you need a budget, you need research, you need monitoring, you need all the other stuff that goes with it. And it needs to be at a whole of government level, not just with any particular ministry. But thank you, Emily. I appreciate the advice about keeping it simple.
If it's too complex, it may not come across as something that's replicable at scale. You lose traction.
Yeah, I think that's where I'm hoping. I just have not had the time. I'm hoping that the fact-finding survey and more of the document analysis is going to reveal a lot more examples around these 8 or maybe more strategies, interministry strategies that we can point to, and people then might get into a discussion about that specific strategy. How do we build an interministry mechanism? How do we measure and monitor the capacity of the frameworks, that kind of stuff? It shifts the conversation away from a particular issue, particular program, particular framework, but it goes more into a systems change discussion, which I think we need to get better used to and get better at using if we're going to change the systems to make sure that the programs are sustainable. Going to go to item 2, and it's again a fairly simple idea that at an interministry level, there should be a list of issues that the government-wide has identified as being most relevant to their children and youth. It's before it gets into the job of assigning the different tasks to different ministries to address those challenges. And looking for examples of that, there are lots of different surveys about adolescent health or child health or youth risk behaviors or social emotional development or attitudes towards climate change. There are lots of independent sector specific or issue specific surveys, but creating a portrait within the country of what's happening to children and adolescents in the country, I think we're going to have trouble digging that out of at least the work we're doing, and encouraging that behavior that the country look at the whole child, every child, and particularly children who are marginalized, and looking at it not only in terms of their particular issue or program or framework, but in terms of the overall development of the child. And that's again not a thing that jumps off the page in any of the materials that we've been reviewing. And if that isn't the starting point, then by definition we're going to be dealing with specific programs and approaches. And then the next decisions around allocating resources to those issues and allocating within ministries. Of course, that's the macro governmental stuff, which heads of state, first ministers need to deal with. Item 3, ensuring that the frameworks address what I call the learning relevant, realistic and related clusters of issues and programs. The cluster of issues and programs we've talked about, there's lots of examples of where the framework is so broad that people are never going to get to deal with all the issues. And I'm going to talk about our experience in Canada when at the national level, the health promotion agenda was taken over in addressing non-communicable diseases. And we were kept on being told that no, it's going to be a whole child approach. We're just going to deal with the chronic diseases first, and you'll get to talk about the other issues of safety and climate change and on all those other issues soon. We'll just wait and we'll deal with physical activity and nutrition and smoking. And don't worry, it's coming. And maybe we'll get to, eventually the conversation did turn to mental health, but it never got beyond other social issues that are obviously challenging to schools as well. And then the second part of that conversation is that for educators, the learning relevance of the issue and the program are going to be more important than often outsiders from the system think about. If you look at the issue of school nutrition, well, let's take the general first. The educators know that healthy kids learn better, and learning better leads to more productive citizens. That's, nobody's making a counter argument to that. But and all educators will be worried about kids who are overweight because of their long-term implications of their health. But educators will be most concerned and more willing to act in a sustained way about hungry kids because hungry kids can't learn. Or they'd be more concerned about abused kids because abused kids can't learn. Or they'd be more worried about bullied kids because bullied kids can't learn. In other words, the learning relevance is the factor that will engage educators in the long term, and not just what issues that we're trying to bring to the table. And school meals has been successful because it's been really relevant to learning. It really is not possible to learn if you're hungry. And then the other part is the realistic, making sure that the objectives of the program are realistic for what schools can achieve over a couple of years as kids leave school. It's not just, we're not going to solve the problem of obesity by school programs. Comments on that? I'm being a little controversial to try to get people to talk. Sorry. Right. I'm just going to check the chat and see if I've missed them. Okay, I'm just going to scan the chat.
I wonder too if part of the issue is helping schools deal with all kinds of disruption lately, and so helping them be flexible and respond to the issues of the day while still referring to a solid framework. So obesity may be the issue of the day, or COVID may be the issue of the day, but you're helping them adapt very quickly because you have a framework in place that allows this kind of flexibility and also has a solid base behind it.
Yeah, I'll pick up that, and also Sri Kayla's comment as well about the education seems to deciding which which sectors are relevant and being included in the frame. The English experience, in my view, was replicated in New Zealand. The Healthy Schools program in England and New Zealand allowed the educators to choose the health issues. They didn't come from the health ministry. And the great success in engaging schools and expanding the program because educators were addressing the health and social issues that concern their kids. The health ministry was not getting their issues covered, which were the chronic disease issues primarily. And so eventually the health ministry withdrew its support, and both those Healthy Schools programs were abandoned. And so that's the politics of the intergovernmental stuff that we need to be aware of and need to be negotiating all the time, because the education system will choose, as noted in the chat box, they will decide which sectors are relevant to the needs of their kids. And that's just the reality. Again, talking the inside perspective rather than the outsider perspective. So we need to fit in their frame, not the other way around, in my view. Okay, I'm going to go to then just close some stuff so I can see the screen. The whole of government strategies, and that's, as you well know, doing whole of government anything is really challenging, but having the whole of government have a holistic policy on the development of children and youth rather than any specific or sector specific issue is challenging. I was encouraged to find a couple in the documents we've been collecting. And so I think it is a doable deed. It just needs to be strengthened. And again, that's something that governments can consider having that frame as a starting point. So I think we've already talked about item 5. Item 6, again, it's a very practical example. There are examples of comprehensive interministry agreements to implement a framework. The brief has a couple of examples. Again, I'm going to go to my Canadian history. The first example I saw of something as comprehensive was the Quebec agreement between the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Education. Actually, it's the Ministry of Health and Social Services. It's social protection and health in one ministry, and education. And so they established a framework for all interministry initiatives, all frameworks. And so that was, I think, a really good kind of idea that can be done at that level. And it guides the rest of the actions from there on. And I think that's, again, a sort of practical example of hopefully we can find more examples of that. Item 7, it's still not quite finished in terms of the text, but it's an idea that's been promoted by the Global Partnership for Education. It's joint sector reviews. I'm not fully read up on it, but I think most JSRs have been used to address specific issues or specific learning challenges. But if those reviews could be assessing the implementation and effectiveness of various frameworks individually or collectively, that would be a good process for that tool to be used. And there seems to be a real body of knowledge about how to do that effectively. And examples that the Global Partnership for Education has promoted. And then the last one I'll go to, because it's fairly obvious, but we've talked quite a bit in terms of having full-time coordinators rather than focal points, and having a full-time coordinator for each framework that's being attempted is kind of a minimum staffing level. You can go on to talk about those coordinators being jointly appointed by the ministries involved in the partnership. The European Network of Health Promoting Schools was founded on that idea. And we've emulated that in Canada when we set up the joint consortium in health and education in government, that the coordinators were responsible for reporting to both ministries or all ministries involved, not just to their own ministry. And the process is really interministerial throughout. And then having structures within the ministry. Again, I'm going to talk about my Canadian experience, but we're hoping to find other examples. I'm talking about the local school board that I live in, where in the Surrey School Board, the Healthy Schools Coordinator, the Safe Schools Coordinator, and the Community Schools Coordinator all reported to the same boss. And so there was automatic cooperation because the coordinators were all reporting to, had coordinated the lines of reporting and authority. So that's the kind of idea that in that example. So I'm going to stop and reflect more on that page. Is there something that, is there another strategy, another specific interministry strategy or whole of government strategy that you're aware of? You could either raise now or send it to me by email right away. I'll try to chase it down before the brief. Or are we, is that an acceptable list of strategies at this point for people to think about? Again, I'm going to look to the chat to see if they comments. Just yeah, people, it is getting close to the end. Close to the end of the hour. So, in fact, it is past the end of the hour. Is there? And I'll just just going to go to the final slide, I think. And that's what I'm suggesting for actions out of this. Jump into the TES consultations. Try not to drown because it's a lot of stuff. We're going to create a page on the Fresh website under that, under the About and Activities section. So follow that. I'd also recommend the statement that's being developed by the educator groups, and that's teachers, school principals, school district administrators, ministry officials, school psychologists, counselors, and deans of education statement, if you can find it there. And of course, my email address if you have any questions or comments. So I'm hoping that these 8 ideas, better practices, because I've always hesitated, even better or best practices, that good practice might be a better one, or a practice that's worked in some context maybe is even more cautious. But I'm hoping these are practices that help us build more sustainable frameworks. So I'll stop and ask for any final comments or questions, and we'll finish up. And thank you for joining us on such short notice.
I think your recognition of the challenges of schools is really important and can be helpful. And also the idea of including this with a number of as a proposal where a number of good practices are being discussed can be helpful, because I often wonder how it is that practitioners go through databases of good practices and decide what to use and how. So, you know, talking about that change level should be important. I think, yeah, it'll be worthwhile getting the feedback too in that meeting to see what's doable and what's the most effective for people. But recognizing the challenges is a good starting space.
Yeah. Well, I think we just need to think more systems than issues and programs. That's been at least our experience in school health anyway. It's been
Yeah, yeah, and not to have your systems level thinking about take on my program, but yeah, a framework for thinking about everything is more useful, I think.
Yeah, that's right. It's yeah, right on in terms of the real intent of this framework is for you to address my issue.
Yeah, yeah, and even as someone who's interested in all of those things, it gets to be overwhelming. So thinking about those people who are implementing it everywhere, I can't imagine how they even have the time to look at their possibilities.
Further comments? I'm just going to turn off the recording and